different moves, same part.
So ask anyone who has spent any time in the fitness community, and you will hear from them that the reason we use different exercises that work the same thing, like a hammer curl or a preacher curl versus just a standard bicep curl, we do that to keep the muscles confused so that somehow we will trick the muscles into making bigger or better or more lasting gain. John, I'm curious, on average, when you work with someone new, how often is it that that is something that you have to address with a new client, percentage-wise?
Most of my clients are not too worried about that aspect, so I'm fortunate in not having to go into it and describe it. When I was at the gym, though, it was common, especially like group exercise classes. If it was the same exercise program, like one workout class to another, there was this like disappointment. We did this Monday and it's Wednesday's class. So the way I've always thought about it, there's 7 kind of fundamental human movements: a squat, a hinge or deadlift, lunge, pressing horizontally or vertically, or pulling horizontally or vertically. And no matter what exercise we come up with, there's just those 7 movements, and we want to get good at those 7 movements. The muscle confusion camp, I think, kind of tries to make it more complicated than it is. We're trying to confuse the muscles, and I remember hearing that, especially early on, this premise of muscle confusion. It was a reasoning for not doing the same workout again over and over. It's almost change for the sake of change more than anything.
The way that I like to think about that is when you ask the question, why are we doing all of these different movements for the same body part? And then there's this fervorance that develops because you got to keep those muscles confused. You got to switch it up. That way you maximize your gains. Just thinking about that in terms of the amount of attention alone that you would have to give to even considering, you have to lay that shit all out week by week forever about not repeating the same exercise twice, because the implication there is that if you do the same exercise this week that you did last week, well, your body is already aware of that one. You got to sneak up on it, you got to trick it. If you don't, then nothing's going to happen. The way that I like to communicate that to people is that is no less exhausting than thinking of something new and exciting that you have to make for every single meal.
Right.
And you kind of hinted at it just now on the stuff that you were talking about, but let's talk a little bit about why that gets said. Why do people stand on this thing for muscle confusion? Now, I'll say that far more often than people would like to admit is that, you said it earlier, we want to make it more complicated so that there is a reason for us to not get bored. That is a huge reason. When you go, that seems like it does exactly the same shit as this thing does. Like if you're doing a seated row and then someone goes, okay, we're going over to the seated row on this machine. And you go, well, didn't we just get done doing the seated row? Yeah, but this hits it in a different way. No, not really. There is validity in changing angles and things like that, but all things look equal aside from it just being a different machine or different grips or whatever. It is the same.
My wife was wanting some advice for working out. She was wanting to do a back workout. And I was like, well, you can do a horizontal row with a flexed hip or an extended hip. You can do a vertical pull with a vertical hip or with an extended hip or a flexed hip. You can do single arm rows with a flexed hip or an extended hip.
Yeah.
That's about it.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm not trying to be rude, dear. I mean, it's pulling.
Yeah, that's kind of it. I mean, you could do a couple of good mornings or whatever, but that's flex hip with a rigid back.
And again, part of it, I think, is the fitness industry validating its own self, sense of novelty, right? And giving trainers purpose and meaning. Because if you have to confuse the muscles, then this whole thing of exercise selection becomes a bigger thing. And, which exercises did we do? And then am I pairing them up the best exercises with the right exercises and all this? At the same time, if you're not moving or doing something, right? Something is going to be better than nothing, and it doesn't really matter your exercise order, I would argue. I mean, yes, we can talk about min maxing, and sure, there's some validity to that aspect, but if we're talking about not moving versus moving, let's get moving.
If we go back to the scenario where you talk about how you have to plan something new and exciting to eat for every meal,
right?
Eventually, that leads to, if you don't have the kind of budget that would allow you to hire someone else to do that, then eventually the pendulum swings in the exact opposite direction, and you're like, well, fuck this. I'm going to have a bowl of cereal for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch.
Sandwich every day.
Yeah, a ham and cheese sandwich every day, and I'm going to eat fucking ice cream and Mountain Dew for dinner. It just, not really, but it becomes this thing where you turn around and head the exact opposite direction, where your meals become quite predictable. Because if someone laid something on you like better health was only available as long as you had this high variance of meals, then none of us would get involved in it. It would eventually be it would require too much attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so that reduces your inclination to want to do that thing. When someone's like, look, take everything that you have in your life, all the shit that requires attention, and add this thing that will never leave you alone. You must do it a couple of times a day. And so you have to spend all this time planning for it. And that gets exhausting. And you don't want to do that. So you get this reduced inclination. The other thing, you actually just talked about it just now. We tend to focus on things that are the easiest to grasp rather than the things that are the hardest to grasp. I was working with someone this morning and they said, so here are the exercises that I do. Are these good exercises?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, yeah, I mean, the plan, the plan that you have laid out here looks like a normal workout protocol. That's fine. But when you're developing a workout protocol, the important thing to note is that there are the exercises to do, and then there is how to do them.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have to take into account, are those even exercises that you need to be doing for whatever your goals are? Are your goals that you want to get fit? Or do you want to get out of pain? Do you just want to get more mobile? Now, taking that aspect and saying, well, how do I go about untangling that big ball of Christmas lights? That is a far more complicated thing and requires a lot of attention at first. But at first, once you nail down the process and you figure all that out, it's not like it's this renewing sense of getting a needle or a dull knife, dug into your rib cage. It's not like you need to think of a creative meal every single time you eat.
No, you find creative processes to kind of build them in, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a mobility standpoint, we've talked about stacking it on top of other rituals that you already have in your life.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of having to, just set around aside 15 minutes to do this mobility, it's find places in your life that you already have some dead time that you've already ritualized, whether it's waiting around for your cup of coffee or how you open up a car door or something of that nature, whatever it may be. Again, share for me, it was when I fed my dog. I did a hip hinge on a single leg.
Yeah.
Right? I fed and watered the dog, and that bled into picking up shoes or picking up things off the floor, which then became everything of how I picked up things.
And interestingly, when you apply that kind of attention, it's way easier to integrate.
Maybe another psychological benefit is, if we say I have this 15-minute session workout and I miss it, or I remember at the last minute to do it, and then it's rushed and halfway through. It can be kind of a judgmental process on ourselves too. Like, I missed this again. Whereas if the goal or the intention is every time I have this moment or this thing happen in my life, I try to tag this along. We're successful sometimes, we're not successful other times. But again, just having that intention and building it into a habit.
Okay, so we've talked about how that kind of mindset of trying to find something new and creative every single time can lead to reduced inclination. Let's talk for just a second about what we were just building on, which is there's the exercise to do, then there is how it should be done. Now, this is going to seem like it's kind of running off in a different direction, but it is important. When you have an exercise that you're going to perform, there really is a most beneficial way to get it done. Most often it is relative. For instance, I could say, well, running is running, but how you run, how each person is maximally benefited when they run is a different story. So you have this person who is approaching an exercise in a way that they are being coached to approach it. And depending on the level of qualification of the coach, if this person doing the coaching is encouraging you as the person doing the exercise to perform that exercise exactly the same way that they do, in a best worst case scenario, what'll happen is nothing. You won't get any benefit from it. When you're doing a bicep curl, for instance, and you see somebody in the gym who's using their shoulder and centrifugal force to yank the weight up, at best, that's going to be one of those people where you look at them and you go, man, they've been coming in here like clockwork. for 17 years, and I've only ever seen them degrade.
Right.
Like they've just slid further and further
Mm-hmm.
into whatever state. Versus the worst case scenario is that you do this exercise in this way, or someone who is underqualified looks at you and tells you that, oh no, you need to do more weight than that. And now you've increased your potential for injury.
Yeah.
And so we either have this road that we head down toward just not getting any benefit, or down this road where we get less than no benefit, which is injury.
Well, you reminded me of it in high school, how we were taught how to squat. And like I've shared
Please.
before, we had a squat rack that extended away from the wall that had safeties, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the frame, the coaches had put a bungee cord. And the whole goal was you put that bungee cord somewhere behind your knees, and that was about your depth. And then coaches would just tell you, yeah, just sit back until you touch your butt to the bungee cord.
Regardless
Right?
of how tall you are.
That was us squatting with weight on our back, with back squats. So you can imagine all the various forms of different squats that we all probably had. And I mean, we put crazy weights on there just, relative to what our size was and things of that nature. And we went with it.
And the relativity of who you are as people doesn't change where that metric is, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe if someone taller, we'd slide up the bungee cord, but by and large, most people were just kind of lazy. So the bungee cord would probably get left in an approximate median. And
yeah,
that was what it was.
And then you have a bunch of people whose goal is playing football, not lifting weights.
Right.
So when, for instance, you have somebody who's really tall that goes to do a squat, and your coach walks off, in the meantime, and says, okay, when so-and-so gets on there, make sure to move that bungee cord up. Not let's do some tests to figure out where that is. Just move the bungee cord up a bit.
Yep.
So there's this idea that exercises are all going to work the same for every person. It should be said that every exercise that you approach that has standard mechanics to it has to, or is developed with an idea in mind that you will fit that exercise to you. So the exercise is demonstrated in such a way as to be generic. It just assumes that everyone falls into this kind of bracket. Right. Where it's like bumpers on sides of a bowling lane. It's one of those things where the exercise has to assume that you either fit in the balance it has established, or that you are going to adapt that for you. And many times that just doesn't work.
I'll see often push-ups that are having clients go to a point of being able to keep their shoulders back. They only go so far down as they can maintain that. And then commonly what will end up happening is they end up rounding the shoulders, collapsing the chest to get further down, or they start dropping their head, reaching the head towards the floor versus the actual torso moving towards the ground, creating different movement compensations. And it's like, no. As much as I express, like, I do not care how far you go. It does not matter how deep you go, right? We're worried about keeping the activation in one particular area. We're worried about keeping the control and stability versus just going from point A to point B is, this raw distance for whatever credit that we believe we get there.
Yeah, right.
I find it's very difficult to waterboard a horse, but you can't make it drink water. As hard as one can try to teach this, I find it's very, very difficult to kind of help people realize and make that point. I always go back to it, and I think all movement is a skill. If we can think of movement as a skill, right, every regression to an exercise is us just doing remedial exercises, as if we were in class somewhere. You're rebuilding the foundation to be able to do the more complicated exercise and more complicated problems.
So in that, you just said building a skill. So in other episodes, we cover or will cover the premise of periodization. To give a simple example, when you first start running, it's difficult for you to run a mile. After you've been running for some given period of time, presumably when you get quote unquote used to it, it's no longer difficult for you to run a mile. So then you don't experience the same kind of improvements that you did on the way to getting to where a mile wouldn't be difficult for you to run. So what do? You up it to 2 miles.
Right.
And now that becomes a little more difficult for you to run. and then it isn't, and then you up it to 3 and whatever, right? That's how
Mhm.
people train for marathons and shit. Well, eventually what ends up happening is the need to switch up an exercise, not because you need to confuse your muscles, but because your body's capability for adaptation, the positive kind of adaptation, has more or less occurred, and now you are not going to get the same kind of challenge and therefore not the same kind of benefit out of that thing that you have become used to.
What kind of time period would you estimate for that, for the body to adapt? About what do you estimate for the period of time it would take?
Depending on the increment that you're talking about, how long per mile, we're assuming a general level of
Mhm.
health and body weight, probably around 2.5 to 3 weeks.
I always say about 4 to 6 weeks.
Oh no, before it starts getting easier. Like just
Okay.
before it starts getting easier,
Hmm.
right? I mean, it will progressively get easier along the way,
Yes, I
but
got you now.
the amount of time it would take for you to have
Hmm.
a noticeable reduction in
Hmm.
in the severity of your experience would be about 2.5 to 3 weeks. Probably anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks before you go, okay, I need to add a little more,
Yeah.
right? Do you agree
That's
with
kind of
that?
how I look about 4 to 6 weeks to make kind of a major periodization change. And then going
Yeah.
that back to again the idea of a skill and muscle confusion. There's the sake of novelty, just for the sake of novelty, and then there's the novelty because you've been doing the same exercise for 4 to 6 weeks. You've
Mm-hmm.
been doing the same kind of program and tempo and scheme for 4 to 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that you necessarily have to confuse the muscle while that may sell t-shirts, so to speak, right? It is that now you have a different stimulus being put into the body, whether it be a different deadlift style or variation, going from two-legged exercise to a single leg exercise. But now again, doing it for about 4 to 6 weeks,
It's
training
a
this new
different
skill or the variation of this skill.
Yeah, it's a different kind of energy burn, right? So
Hmm.
when you take that, and let's again go back to the way relatable for everyone kitchen scenario. Now let's say that you have to think of something new and exciting every single meal.
Right,
Means that you will never get good at making any of them
right.
ever. You want to get really good at making a cake. Make a cake every single day for
Hmm.
for 4 to 6 weeks. I
Yeah.
guarantee you the cake at the end of 6 weeks will look miles different than the cake at week 1.
That's a key factor for a lot of people.
Hmm.
And it's one of the things that always kind of bugged me about fitness classes. Again, not to rag on them, but is within fitness classes that I was teaching or went to. Right, it was always a new exercise, always a new workout. Like, and it was never really this sense of being able to work at one exercise and get good at a squat or get good at overhead press. It was today's overhead press with a kettlebell, and now we're doing overhead press with a barbell. It's not that there's anything bad with any of those variations. It's just, again, they're different animals, so to speak, or they have different challenges presented with them. And so while you can use the skills and lessons learned from one, you're also, again, continuing with a different animal again, as I said.
When you go into a class and everybody says, "Okay, put on the gloves and the mitts," and then you start throwing strikes at these focus mitts, and you've never thrown a punch before in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, by the end of that class, you are better at it than you were when you started, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to turn in a really quality workout. You spent time just getting used to even doing these movements.
Mm-hmm.
And you go back the next day and they're like, "Okay, time for stair climbing."
Yeah.
And you're like, Okay, what about the oh no, we got to confuse the muscles."
Yep.
That's not how that works. Like you've said many times, you have to give yourself time to learn the skill. Unfortunately, right around the time when you get really good at the skill, that's around the time when it's time for you to change it up. However, when you go back to that thing in a few months, now you can remember how to do it, and your progress with it will be impacted accordingly. So let's talk about what different exercises are actually for.
Big way that I look at different exercises partially can be to help in a rehab sense,
Mm.
or a corrective exercise in trying to jumpstart a particular muscle group
Mhm.
to be maybe participatory during a more compound exercise. So this could be something like glute bridges, someone laying on their back with their feet underneath their knees and pressing through their heels to extend their hips. I commonly use this to help like train core engagement as well as glute activity. Using that as a way to kind of prime and get the body used to using the glutes and the core working in tandem versus all one and not the other. And
Mhm.
then having them come to do a compound movement like a squat, or now let's on your feet standing get that same muscle activation through the squat. So
Mhm.
again, we're two different movements where we're connecting to the glutes to get them to activate, but again, trying to use it in two different manners so that when we build from one step going up to the next step.
So we can all do this simple experiment
Mm-hmm.
right now. And this is just establishing some relatability to the premise that we're talking about. If you do a body weight squat, meaning that you are going to try and squat like you are about to sit in a chair, with the goal being that from a standing position, your shoulders are more or less situated over your ankles. And throughout the squat, your shoulders will basically stay situated over your ankles. Now, there will be some forward or backward movement, but by and large, that's not a bad metric to go for. Would you agree, John?
Yeah, that's a pretty good squat.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, throughout, your shoulders will move along a vertical plane where they basically stay over the ankles. Now, if when you're doing your squat, you shift your weight to be borne primarily through the balls of your feet, like right by the toes, when you go down into your squat, you will likely feel the effort of your squat shifted toward your quads and then into your knees, depending on how much you're leaning forward. If you shift your weight into your heels and go into your squat with the same things in mind, your hips are moving back. It's just the metric there is keeping your shoulders situated over the ankles. If you're pressing through your heels, then it's likely that you will feel that effort go more into the glutes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, into the glutes, not the hip joint.
Right.
As in with the squats where you had your weight shifted forward, you felt that going into your quads, tending toward your knees, quite likely. Now that's just with body weight.
Right.
If you do that loaded with more weight than just what you weigh, the more weight you do that with, or the more tension or the more demand you are placing on wherever you felt that, depending on where your weight was situated. The muscles that you felt involved when you had your forward tending squat going into the balls of your foot, those muscles work in an ideal squat, i.e. the one that you are performing when your weight is shifted back into your heels. The muscles of your quadriceps are still involved in the squat.
Yeah.
They just the roles of the primary load bearing muscle versus muscles that are helping it or agonists changes, right? In the one where you're leaning forward, your quads have become the primary load bearing muscle, and your glutes are just helping if they can.
For the ride.
Right, they're just helping if they can. If you shift your weight into the heels, now that role changes and it becomes more feasible and more strength building because it has a more conducive load bearing responsibility distribution.
Or is it the way I was thinking about it? If you're towing a vehicle or towing something, you want the big truck to do the towing, not my little Golf, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure I could probably tow something with my little Volkswagen Golf, but it's probably not going to be very big and it's probably not going to be very good for my car.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at, muscles the same way, right? Like the bigger muscles in the human body, we want to do the bigger lifting with.
Mm-hmm.
And even if
that's
it
a good
does,
point. Yeah, that's
right,
a good way to say that.
like,
yeah.
Our asses and our hamstrings are like the two biggest muscle groups in our bodies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's use them when we're lifting up heavy things. Quads are big, yes, I get it, but they're not as big as your hamstrings and your glute muscles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And so let's train those big muscles to do the big lifting.
It's a thing where you think about what the exercise is trying to impact. Now, like we talked about just now, the agonists that are present in any given movement or exercise. You have a target muscle, and then you have the muscles that are going to work to help it depending on how you're challenging it or the angle that you are challenging it.
Right.
And sometimes those change. And even if they don't change, when you change the angle of challenge, you change how different cooperating muscles are lengthened or contracted throughout the movement. And that is what you're after whenever you are changing exercises for the same muscle group. If I'm doing a curl, like a standard bicep curl, and I take my elbows forward of my rib cage, and then I go and I do this curl. When I'm doing that, I have my anterior delt, or the front part of my shoulder, working along with my bicep and brachialis, as well as the muscles in my forearms and hand, to make sure that this movement is safe and effectual. Now we take the same exercise, and you've seen those people who get the that kind of chest plate that they wear, that's like this strap that you put around your neck. You seat your elbows in it
for a standing preacher curl or something.
Yeah, it's almost like a preacher curl, except that your hands can sit ideally spaced. Well, that changes the agonists that are involved, meaning that now you've reduced the agonists that are involved by one, or by one group, which is the front part of the shoulder.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that exercise at all. Just with that utility, now you are working more on your biceps and brachialis. With not using the utility, you're working on your anterior delt and how that stabilizes the movement as well. There's nothing wrong with doing either one of those exercises at all. It just changes what agonists come into play. And that's an important distinction to make. There are plenty of exercises where you change it up and it hits the target muscle. Yes, it just changes the agonists that are involved, and that's okay.
Typically, if you're thinking of like a classic bodybuilder workout, I feel that's a little bit of what their goals are. If you have what I would consider like a decent bodybuilder program, it's going to start with maybe more compound and free weights. Then it slowly gets more into cables and then machine work, where again, we're depending on machines to kind of hold us in place and just get a pump through a muscle. Versus, again, this sense of stabilizing this kind of global whole body idea working. But in the game of hypertrophy and getting as much of a pump and a squeeze in particular areas, that's what one must do to do there, right? It's not that we're doing 15 varieties of bicep curls for the sake of biceps. How can I get as much squeeze and working in my bicep? And then as I get fatigued and more tired out and still need to be able to get more drive through these areas, how do we find ways of doing this without endangering ourselves?
The important thing to recognize is that those target muscles, the main mover in that movement, is still being targeted. Voluntary muscles, meaning muscles that you move because you think about moving them, if they respond, they are extending or contracting. And that's all. There's not a third thing that they can do other than extend or contract. They can freeze in various expressions of those states. They can get tension expressed at all points throughout either that contraction or that extension. But there's not a third state where, just make your muscle ripple. Like that's not a thing.
Once you realize that it is just a contraction and an extension of a joint, or as you're saying, of the muscle belly, once we realize that's what's at play, you can kind of MacGyver exercises for yourself as well. Which, and again, this isn't necessarily to, for the Instagram or to try to get likes and subscribes and creating these crazy single leg squats on a Bosu ball and things of that nature. Rather, MacGyvering exercises, whether you're, again, on vacation, you're lacking access to maybe gym equipment, right? If you can understand some of these principles, then you can create a workout scheme for yourself with lacking equipment. Or maybe you just have reduced equipment available to you, so you have to, again, create other ways of working out that still get the same effort. One of my favorite examples for things like this is rotator cuff exercises. Right? You see, with bands, is you have this tension that goes along the band. So no matter where the angle of the band is, right, the tension is along that band. When we pick up free weights and we do, these kind of externally rotated shoulder exercises, there's some benefit to rotator cuff, but not as much as I think people think they're getting. You do that same movement, but maybe lay down on your belly and then try doing those rotations. Completely different exercise now. Right. Because again, the way gravity pulls on those, or if you lay on your side to do external rotations because you don't have your exercise band, right? You lay on your side and then you can do that same effort to hit the same pattern. But again, that's where your tools may not match up with what your plan is. So how do you make this work?
Well, that harkens back to finding new and creative ways to adapt an exercise to what your needs are. I have a friend who took up speed skating, and it was this version of speed skating like on rollerblades. So kind of like speed skating, you do at the Olympics on the ice. And if you looked at his workout routine, he didn't have typical exercises. He had a bunch of resistance bands anchored to the wall around his hip, and he would lean way far away from those things so that he could get that serious abduction developed in his legs. Now, let's look at a professional athlete, just to harken back to the thing about muscle confusion. In order to get good at that activity, there's really only one way to do that, and that's to do it over and over and over and over again, right? 10,000 hours later, presto.
Well, we used to say that, and again, going back to football in high school, right? No matter how much preseason practice and warm-ups we did,
Mm-hmm.
the first 2 weeks of every football season were the worst when we finally put the pads on and you actually start hitting each other and actually playing football. And it was like, yeah, you might be in shape, but you weren't in football shape.
Right.
And it was,
right.
Until you practice football. And same thing with that jiu-jitsu, guys ask, new guys come in, how do I get better at the cardio? And it's like, well, just roll more.
Yeah.
I don't know what to tell you. Grab a sandbag and just roll around with it at the gym.
Yeah. Well, and if the responsibility was instead finding new and exciting ways to work your cardio, but then you go into this activity that has very specific kinds of demands,
mm-hmm.
you're not good at that because you haven't adapted to it. You've adapted to this thing that you've been doing.
Yep.
Or this variance that you've made your focus.
As trainers, right, they have what they call the SAID principle, the specific adaptation induced demands,
mm-hmm.
right? And plainly stated, right, it's you play like you practice. Mm-hmm. So whatever it is that you're practicing, that's what you're going to elicit when you play, so to speak.
Yeah. So the thing to take into account is that you have different agonists and different demands depending on the activity that you're performing, even if the target muscle doing the bulk of the work is the same. And you have specific things that you have to train for in order to be able to accomplish them more efficiently or effectively. When you practice at those things and enter into states of periodization so that you can maximize your need for adaptation rather than having achieved adaptation,
mm-hmm.
when you can implement periodization into your programs or protocols or whatever, you, again, target those different agonists, but you also increase the effective ranges of motion of the target muscle because of the demands that you're putting on the agonists that are also involved.
Right.
So what's the best way to go about developing those protocols while you are in a state of developing, not achieving, but a developing adaptation? Number one, stick with an exercise as long as you feel rewarded by it. If you're a runner and you're like, nope, I'm happy running these 3 miles every day, or this 1 mile, or this half a mile, I'm happy running to my mailbox every day. Mm-hmm. Whatever it is, stick with that thing. It's 100% more beneficial than doing nothing. And that's standing on facts. I mean, that just is. It is better to do something rather than nothing. And whatever your something is, if you do that every day for the rest of your life, that's fine. If it's not boring and not doing that means you're not doing anything, then stick with that thing. But if you're going to enter into periodization kind of protocols where you're going to stick with an activity for a certain amount of time, and then once you've adapted to that and it's no longer as demanding, you're going to go switch it up and get into another activity. One of the best things that you can do is learn the science-based connections for what those exercises target. So if you're doing the curls that we were talking about and you have that thing on your chest, you learn that now your delts aren't affected. When you take that off and you're doing a curl correctly, now your delts are affected. And there are benefits to each of those exercises. Learn them. But more importantly, learn how those things might be beneficial or not beneficial for you. If you're a mechanic and you stand in one of those dugouts all day and you have your arms up above you unscrewing oil filters and changing oil all the time, then you might not need to recruit your delts over much because you're doing it all day, every day, right? So take into consideration, well, do I do this thing? Is this thing actually helping me? Maybe I need to get one of those chest apparatuses so that my delts aren't affected. Learn those science-based connections. Then you can learn those science-based connections so that you can learn what's applicable, but then you can also learn what is safe. You can learn what's bullshit. When someone says something like, no, we're going to do this bench press, and first we'll start off with dumbbell flat bench press, and you go, okay, and so you've got these dumbbells and you're doing it, and assuming that's working fine and it's doing whatever it's doing, and then someone says, okay, now at the top, when you get to the top, you're going to squeeze those elbows in and then try and touch those elbows together. Now, sure, but examine what that might do to the rest of your alignment. So is it beneficial for the chest? Maybe, but that's only when we're isolating the benefit to the chest. It might be wreaking havoc on your shoulders when they pull so far apart from behind, depending on how much mass you have to get around in the front. It might not be the best thing for your alignment with your elbows. It might not be the best thing for any degree of weakness you have in the forearms. And if there's a breakdown in that chain everywhere or anywhere, and you've got 40 or 50 pounds of dumbbells over your head, so learn the science-based connections. Once you get to that state of periodization, you can learn what you're going to trade out. While you are working through a period where you have your programs or your protocols or whatever, and you have a specific set of exercises that you're performing, that's not a bad time for you to casually just look at, oh, what other exercises can I do? Right? And trade those out once the time comes. It's not a bad way to spend your to spend your attention rather than thinking about the different exercise you have to perform every single time that you walk into the gym.
Right.
That shit's not rewarding. It's bullshit. And the only thing it leads to is you not being able to do an exercise well. So just remember that there is some science-based reasoning behind performing different movements for the same muscle. But listen to the science. The bullshit around that, when somebody's just got this like sweaty-eyed look in their face, and they're, maniacally telling you, "No, man, you got to fucking confuse this muscle." That's anecdotal. It's probably not applicable, and chances are you're going to be coached into some aspect or position that's going to be unsafe ultimately. Right. And incorrectly identifying markers of benefit and then incorrectly identifying markers of pain.
And, I guess to add to your, like, the markers of benefit, right, is the sense of, again, we want to have a stable environment and move to a less stable, never an unstable. Your exercises, the best exercise is going to be a stable exercise where we're challenging our stability, but again, we're not going to be in an unstable environment.
A quick example of that would be something like someone says, "Oh, I need to work on my balance." And so what they do is they grab a knee and pull it up to their chest and try and balance like that, rather than shifting their weight and lifting the other foot 1 inch off the floor.
Right.
One of those is a less stable environment. The other one is an unstable environment.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Quick example. When someone is performing an exercise and they say, "Oh, I just got dizzy." The number of times I have seen people set weight down, get up and start walking around to shake off this dizziness. Don't go walking around and making it an unstable environment. Sit your ass down. You know what I mean? That's an example that we all deal with. The number of times I've seen people get up and try to walk off dizziness rather than just sit down and wait for it to go away.
I'll have clients and I'll see them in their face like, "You okay?" Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just a little dizzy as they're stumbling. Why did you? One of them even vaulted up off the ground and launched themselves up to their feet. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Don't need you to fall and eat shit on concrete.
So keep those things in mind and understand that there's a great, big, wide, wonderful, exciting world of possibility out there. You don't need to muddle it with some frantic search for exercises that are new and unfamiliar every single time you ever work out.
And I feel that's going to be more of a disservice than any type of benefit for the individual.
Yeah.
Ultimately, treat it as a skill, learn the skill, grow the skill, and then learn how to challenge that skill. And through that process, you'll have whatever developments you're looking for: muscular growth, muscular definition. You're looking to lean out, all of those things. If you're working on mobility issues and trying to alleviate pain, all of it, it comes back down to this simple premise of treating exercise and movement as a skill.
There you go. And with that,
stay mindful as fuck.
And don't compensate. All right, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thanks for
Take
listening.
care.